This is the fourth video in a 5-part series exploring the history of Mesopotamian civilization from before the first cities to the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And it's also part of a series on the broader history of the seventh threshold of Big History being the name of the academic field that studies history in its entirety, and the seventh threshold being the agrarian era starting around 11,000 years ago with the first agricultural communities. In this video, we'll consider the story of Mesopotamian civilization from the rise through the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Neo-Assyrian kings reigned for some 300 years and came to rule the largest empire to have ever existed up to that point. Babylonia, along with Media, ended Assyrian rule, and Babylon arose in Assyria's stead. Neo-Assyria, what's your story? Ashur, the city that remained the religious capital of Assyria throughout its history, started the millennium as the political capital as well of a much shrinkened Assyrian power. Having been a major power before, as they grew in the face of Mitannian weakness and beyond in the Middle Assyrian period, they had a local tradition of great conquering kings to aspire to. Those aspirations would start turning to reality in the second half of the 10th century BC, starting under Ashur-dan II, the father of Adad-nirari II, and it's Adad-nirari II who's considered the first king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But it's under Nirari II's father, however, that regular military campaigning and conquest re-entered the world of the kingdom of Ashur. Ashur-dan II ruled from 934 to 912 BC, and his primary military concerns were with people in the mountains up north and the Arameans in the west. He re-established what he saw as Assyria's rightful territory in the defeats of the Arameans, and along with his warring in the north, he stabilized the borders of Assyria and established government offices in the provinces. His conquests also provided a place for many displaced Assyrians to live. But of the most historical import, his efforts set the stage for the coming kings to set out from this now stable center. Adad-nirari II, formerly the first king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, succeeded his father Ashur-dan II and ruled from 911 to 891 BC. Adad-nirari both defended the nascent Neo-Assyrian territory and expanded it some. At this point in Assyrian history, warfare was still merely a summer affair, utilizing Assyrian farmers and happening in the months between harvest and sowing. Nirari II deported Arameans and conquered Hittites and Hurrians in the north. By this point, the Hittites and Hurrians no longer had great powers representing them, with the Hurrian-Mitanni Empire and the Hittite Empire having seen their end hundreds of years ago. Adad-nirari then turned his sights to Babylonia and annexed the swath of land after defeating King Shamash-Mudammiq, and he did so once again early in the reign of the subsequent Babylonian king Nabu-shuma-ukin I. But relationships with Babylon improved, continuing into the reign of Adad-nirari's son and successor, Tukulti-Ninurta II. Tukulti-Ninurta's reign was significantly shorter than Ashur-dan and Adad-nirari's, lasting from 890 to 884 BC, and he continued in their warring ways. Beyond firming up previous territorial gains, including against the Hittites, he further successfully campaigned in the Zagros Mountains. Tukulti also defeated and vassalized the king of Bit-Zamani, Ami-Baal. His son, whose name translates to Ashur is guardian of the ear, succeeded him. Ashurnasirpal II's reign ran from 883 to 859 BC. He waged a lot of war during this period, and Assyria grew larger still. Some weren't thrilled being subject to Ashurnasirpal, and after suppressing a rebellion, he wasn't shy about his brutality. In the words of his monument referring to the men he took prisoner, quote, "Of some I cut off their feet and hands, of others I cut the ears, noses, and lips, of the young men's ears I made a heap, of the old men's heads I made a minaret." Unquote. As for the children, quote, "The male children and female children I burned in flame, the city I destroyed and consumed with fire." Unquote. He also conquered numerous Phoenician and Canaanite cities. Ashurnasirpal had the capital moved from the traditional Ashur to the city of Kalhu, where he had a palace that took 15 years to build constructed. A wall enclosed the almost 900-acre Kalhu, and many temples were built. An inscription describing the palace's inauguration describes how just under 70,000 people were invited, mostly from across the empire, to a banquet which went on for 10 days. A significant hunk of that near 70,000 total, 16,000 were citizens of Kalhu. The palace walls were lined with elaborately carved reliefs, all with a very similar, and in most cases identical, inscription telling the story of Ashurnasirpal. Ashurnasirpal was followed by his son, Shalmaneser III, who ruled from 859 to 824 BC. Shalmaneser contended with many old foes as well as some new ones, including the earliest appearance in recorded history of the Arabs and Chaldeans. He battled against Urartu up north, stabilizing Assyria's hold on land contested between the two, and to the south he helped put down a rebellion against his ally, the Babylonian king Marduk-zakir-Sumi, and describes how he attacked and then pursued the fleeing rebel, and then, quote, cut down with the sword Marduk-bel-Usate and the rebel army officers that were with him, unquote. Shalmaneser also campaigned down the Levantine coast, and after defeating the king of Hama, Urhulani, he continued on, and at the Orontes River, was met by Urhulani along with 10 other kings under their leader in this alliance, King Hadad-ezer of Aram-Damascus. While he describes this venture as a decisive victory, the coming years saw many more battles between the two, and while Shalmaneser wouldn't conquer Aram-Damascus, 841 BC saw him sufficiently successful to bring about tribute coming from the neighboring kingdom of Israel under Jehu, as well as nearby Phoenician cities. This instance of King Jehu is notable for being the only instance of the portrayal of an Israelite or Judean monarch in Near Eastern art. Northwest of the Assyrian heartland, Shalmaneser sent forces into Anatolia against Tabal and Cappadocia. Late in his reign by 826 BC, he faced a revolt by his son Ashur-dan-Pal. A younger son of Shalmaneser, Shamshi-Adad V, fought to put down the revolt and succeeded Shalmaneser. By 820 BC, order had been restored, but Assyria would enter a long period of relative stagnancy and decline. Enter Shamshi-Adad V, king from 824 to 811 BC. Shamshi-Adad fought a successful battle against the Babylonian king Marduk-Balassu-Ikbi and took numerous gods along with booty back with him. His son, Adad-nirari III, followed him and ruled from 811 to 783 BC. Nirari III's father, Adad V, had his primary consort, Shamu-Ramat, survive him, and she's the only definite example of an Assyrian queen to still be called queen after her husband's death, and she was one of the most influential women we know of from the ancient Near East. Adad-nirari ascended to the throne at a relatively young age, and his youth, presumably along with the more general sensitivities transitions of power bring, saw many local rulers and officials attaining greater authority. Over the course of his long 28-year reign, he valiantly fought to keep Assyrian rule strong, but the trends underway would only intensify as central Assyrian authority declined over the coming rulers. Adad-nirari III was followed by his son, Shalmaneser IV, who ruled from 783 to 773 BC. From 783 to 746 BC, 3 Assyrian kings ruled in a period of general decline. Documentation from this time is fairly scarce, and imperial officials are often inscribing great deeds under their own name before the kings. These 3 kings were all brothers, sons of Adad-nirari III. There is Shalmaneser IV, who I've mentioned, and then Ashur-dan III, who ruled from 773 to 755, and finally Ashur-nirari V, who reigned from 755 to 745 BC. Throughout this period, officials grew in power relative to the king, and in the north, the state of Urartu grew. With the kingships of Ashur-dan III and Ashur-nirari V, we see the further development of more years not spent at war. Assyrian kings traditionally went on campaigns every year, and now for 4 years of Ashur-dan's reign, and all but 3 years of Ashur-nirari's, the king did not campaign. 5 years that Ashur-dan did spend fighting were spent putting down revolts. To the revolts away from the core of the empire, we can add a couple of revolts in the Assyrian heartland, speaking to further instability at the very center of Assyrian might. The king who brought Assyria out of this mess followed Nirari V and may have been a successful rebel, though that remains ambiguous. Regardless, however he came to power, Tiglath-Pileser III came to rule Assyria in 745 BC, and his centralization and expansion would bring Assyria beyond where it had ever been before. Pileser III introduced reforms, including the drawing up of smaller provinces to curb the power provincial governors had. He introduced the standing army so he could battle year-round, shifting from the summer month farmer conscript model to a largely professional soldier-based army. Mass deportations increased under his reign, deporting tens or hundreds of thousands of conquered people, both to reduce the risk of revolt and to better utilize underdeveloped areas. In 743 BC, he defeated the king of Urartu near the Urartu vassal Aramean state of Arpad, but Arpad itself would take 3 more years before the city would succumb to Pileser's siege and have its citizens massacred. The lands under Arpad's control were now split into 2 Assyrian provinces, and Arpad itself became a provincial capital. Turning his focus south, he established the provinces of Kulania, Hataraka, and Samira. Further south, 732 BC saw him campaign against and annex the most powerful Levantine state, Aram-Damascus, as well as taking Tyre and Israel, the latter of which he divided into northern and southern halves. With the northern half becoming an Assyrian province, he campaigned even further against many Arab tribal areas, defeating the Kedarite queen. After the Chaldean chieftain Nabu-Mukin-Zeri seized the kingship of Babylon in 731, Pileser blockaded their eastern border to keep the Elamites out of the picture, and then went on the offensive. He conquered Babylon in 729 BC, and for the 2 years before his death, he had the added title of King of Babylon. And out of respect and indeed cultural and religious kinship, unlike the other areas conquered, the Babylonian kingdom wasn't broken down into smaller provinces. The king following Pileser III was his son Shalmaneser V, who ascended to the throne in 727 BC. Shalmaneser V's reign ended quickly in 722 when he was deposed. His brief reign leaves behind little documentation, though he remained king of Babylon, something many future rulers would find difficult, and he also fought in the west of the empire. Shalmaneser is also likely the king, and if not him, his son then, who ended the kingdom of Israel and deported tens of thousands of Israelites. Shalmaneser was deposed by Sargon II, who described Shalmaneser as having tyrannized the people before Ashur, quote, overthrew his rule and appointed me, Sargon, unquote. Sargon ruled from 722 to 705 BC. Early in his reign, Sargon faced multiple rebellions, from Babylon in the south and in the northern Levant by an alliance of several states under Yahu-Bidi of Hama. After first failing to take Babylon, he turned to Yahu-Bidi, and upon conquering him, had him flayed alive, and had many people from Syria deported. He faced further revolts as well. Sargon campaigned against Urartu, the now weakening thorn in the north, and dealt them serious blows. And he also changed the capital, though this would be the shortest lasting capital change of the 4 Assyrian capitals. In his new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, he had constructed the largest Assyrian palace ever built to that point, covering 100,000 square meters. Later in his reign, Sargon managed to bring Babylonia back under Assyrian rule, with Marduk-apla-Iddina finally being taken and exiled to Elam. In his final campaign, up in Anatolia, Sargon was killed, and his death troubled his successor, Sennacherib. Sennacherib ruled from 705 to 681 BC, and right away he distanced himself from Sargon II, whom he believed must have committed a grave sin. Sargon's body had been captured, and so he hadn't been buried, and this meant that he was doomed to an unpleasant eternity in the afterlife, a sure sign of his impiety. Sennacherib moved the capital from Dur-Sharrukin to Nineveh, where it would remain until the city's fall in 612 BC. He had a palace constructed there, saw numerous other building projects through, and extended the city significantly south. The primary military occupation of his reign was with the Babylonians. Early on in his rule they rebelled, and things would go back and forth for some time, including the successful instantiation by Sennacherib of his son Ashur-nadin-Shumi on the throne of Babylon, and then Shumi's subsequent capture and presumed death at the hands of the Babylonians and Elamites. Sennacherib finally wrecked Babylon in 689 BC. In describing what he'd done, part of his inscription reads, quote, I destroyed the city and its houses from foundation to parapet. I devastated and burned them. I razed the brick and earthenwork of the outer and inner wall of the city, of the temples, and of the ziggurat. He continues, quote, I dug canals through the midst of that city. I overwhelmed it with water, unquote. Sennacherib destroyed temples and gods, but Babylon's chief deity, Marduk, he took intact from the city. A son of Sennacherib, Arda-Mulisu, who'd formerly been the crown prince only to have the future kingship given to his younger brother Esarhaddon, now set out to kill Sennacherib. Arda-Mulisu, along with another brother, Nabushar-Usur, killed Sennacherib in a temple. Esarhaddon raised an army to oppose them and successfully marched to Nineveh to take the throne. Esarhaddon ruled from 681 to 669 BC. Early on in his reign, he had to deal with invasions in the northwestern part of the empire by the Cimmerians, finally repelling the Cimmerians from further destruction of temples and cities at a battle at Cilicia. Moving south, he put down the rebellion of the king of Sidon. Then he warred with Urartu, annexing the former Urartu vassal kingdom of Shupria. Finally, he extended Neo-Assyria farther still with the brief conquest of Egypt, whom he defeated in multiple battles before seizing their capital, Memphis. By 669 BC, Pharaoh Taharka reappeared in southern Egypt, and Egypt rebelled against Assyrian rule, and on Esarhaddon's way to put the rebellion down, he died. Beyond war, the most significant thing Esarhaddon did in his reign was arrange the rebuilding of the city of Babylon. The city had been destroyed by his father Sennacherib, and many Babylonian citizens had been deported. Now many Babylonians were returned, and he restored the city gates, many buildings, including the Isagila and the Etemenanki ziggurat complex, and many other structures. Not all the work was finished by the time of his death, and restoration continued into the reign of his sons and successors, Ashurbanipal, who would rule Assyria, and Shamash-Shuma-Ukin, who would serve as king of Babylon in a subordinate position to his younger brother. Though in a subordinate position, he was meant to have autonomy over his affairs, whatever exactly that meant. If that meant controlling the land Babylon traditionally held, Ashurbanipal seems to have not kept to his side of the treaties drawn by their father Esarhaddon. Ashurbanipal ruled from 669 to 631 BC. Early on, he marched to Egypt to face the rebellion that Esarhaddon had died while on the way to put down. Lack of an initial response had exacerbated issues, and the rebellion had spread significantly, reaching Memphis. Ashurbanipal sent his forces, Pharaoh Taharka fled, and the Assyrian army conquered Memphis. Taharka died in 664 BC, and his nephew took the reins of rebellion, captured Thebes, and marched on Memphis. The Assyrian army enters once more, the nephew Tantamani fled, and the Assyrian army plundered Thebes for helping him. This period also saw two conflicts with the Elamites, the second of which ended well for Assyria, and Ashurbanipal instantiated the two new rulers over Susa and Hidalu, and those rulers were the two sons of an earlier Elamite king, and these two sons had previously been granted asylum in Assyria. Like it was for his father, Ashurbanipal's reign continued to see involvement with the Cimmerians, with Lydia entering into a short-lived allyship with Assyria to defend themselves from Cimmerians in 665, and seeking another allyship for the same purpose over a decade later as well. The Cimmerians were also one of the two groups, along with the Medes, that combined to successfully march to the walls of the city of Nineveh while Ashurbanipal was on campaign against Elam. Thankfully for Assyria, allies were called in to rebuff the invaders. Ashurbanipal also oversaw two campaigns against Arab tribes, and of course, Babylon, as before, as after, didn't rest easy. Although Ashurbanipal's father, Esarhaddon, had rebuilt much of Babylon, it took until the start of Ashurbanipal's reign for the statue of Marduk, captured under Sennacherib, to be returned to Babylon. And for a while, things looked like they would be okay, but Ashurbanipal's older brother, Shamash-Shuma-Ukin, king of Babylon, revolted in 652 BC. By 650, the Assyrian army had forged their way to Babylon, and Babylon was under siege. Famine set in, Babylon fell in 648, and Kandalanu was made Ashurbanipal's vassal king of Babylon. Already by the middle of Ashurbanipal's reign, Egypt had been restored to Egyptian rule under Psamtik, an Assyrian court-educated pharaoh who'd become vassal king in 664, eventually established his independence from Assyria, and by the end of Ashurbanipal's reign, dominated the southern Levant as well. In Ashurbanipal's later reign, documentation dries up and internal strife in the empire grew. The latest evidence we have of Ashurbanipal alive comes from 631, and it's thought that that year or shortly thereafter he died. Ashur-etil-ilani, Ashurbanipal's son, ruled from 631 to 627 BC. Kandlanu remained his vassal king of Babylon, and there are no records of military campaigns during his reign. He was followed upon his death by his brother Sin-shar-ishkun. Sin-shar-ishkun ruled from 627 to 612 BC. Early on in 626 BC, a man named Nabopolassar rebelled, assaulting and taking Babylon. Later that year, Nabopolassar was crowned king. Sin-shar-ishkun attacked, but was called away to contend with a usurper who'd taken Nineveh. 620 BC saw Nabopolassar take Uruk and Nippur, and over the ensuing years he pushed north. 615 BC saw him attack the longtime religious capital of Assyria, Ashur. The Assyrian heartland was now under attack. The Medes now entered the picture and attacked Kalhu and Nineveh. Winter saw Babylon and Media retreat, but they came back, and in 612 BC, Nabopolassar and the Medes brutally sacked Nineveh, and presumably Sin-shar-ishkun saw his death there. The sacking and intense destruction of more cities followed. For the remaining 3 years, Ashur-uballit II, who might have been Sin-shar-ishkun's son, ruled the near-to-death Assyrian Empire. He led the defensive from the holdout city of Haran. However, because Ashur had been taken, his full coronation, where Ashur gave over the kingship, couldn't happen. Instead, he was coronated at the Temple of Sin at Haran, and he would only ever be referred to as Crown Prince. After Nabopolassar consolidated his rule in northern Mesopotamia, his army and the Median army set their sights on Haran, and by 609, Haran had fallen and Ashur-uballit II disappears from history. Egypt, who'd previously sent allies for Assyria, would continue the broader battle against Babylonia at this time, but with Haran having fallen, Neo-Assyria itself had come to an end, and Babylonia's time at the top had come once again.